Welcome to Stories of Forgotten Lives. Today, our journey goes back to 1912, uncovering the remarkable story of Joseph, the only black man known to have sailed on the Titanic. His voice remained unheard for more than 8 decades, until his daughter finally chose to speak and ended the silence 83 years later. This is a deeply emotional account, so pause for a moment, take a breath and listen closely. Before we go any further, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. What city and country? Your support makes sure these hidden histories are preserved, not lost. Now let's begin. It was the night of April 14th, 1912, and the most enormous vessel ever constructed was powering through the North Atlantic at top speed. The ocean was still, the sky cloudless, and over 2,000 souls rested peacefully, unaware that within hours most of them would perish. Among the passengers was one man whose incredible story would stay buried for nearly a century. His name was Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche. He was 25 years old, a qualified engineer fluent in 3 languages, and the only black passenger aboard the RMS Titanic. Yet you've never come across his name in a film, nor seen his face in any documentary. For 83 years, the world had no memory of him until his daughter, at the age of 84, decided to finally speak out and reveal what truly unfolded that night. This is a tale woven with love, prejudice, sacrifice, and a pledge never fulfilled. Its beginning is not at sea, but on a small Caribbean island, inside a house that carried the scent of coffee and sea breeze. Joseph was born on May 26, 1886, in Cap Haitian, a coastal town in northern Haiti. At the time, Haiti was still recovering from years of political unrest. Joseph's family, however, stood apart. They weren't impoverished or desperate. His father had served as a military officer with government ties, and his mother usually belonged to a well-regarded family within Haiti's elite. They lived in a home with wooden shutters and a garden bursting with tropical flowers. Growing up, Joseph heard French spoken at the dining table. Education was deeply valued by his parents. They believed knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken from you. And from an early age, they noticed a unique spark in their son. Joseph was endlessly curious, questioning everything around him. He had to understand how things functioned. He'd take apart old clocks just to study their inner workings and would observe ships arriving at the harbor, marveling at how such massive vessels could stay afloat. His mother saw this hunger in him. She understood that Haiti at that time couldn't give Joseph the kind of education he deserved. Opportunities were scarce, schools offered little, but she held a vision for him. She dreamed of Joseph becoming an engineer, not just any engineer, but one trained in Europe, someone capable of designing machines and building bridges, someone who could eventually return and contribute to rebuilding Haiti. So in 1901, when Joseph turned 15, his mother made a choice that would forever alter his path. She sent him to France. This was no ordinary journey. Traveling from Haiti to France in those days took weeks. Joseph boarded a steamship carrying a modest suitcase and a letter of introduction from his father. He remained quiet for most of the voyage, spending his days on deck, gazing at the horizon and imagining what Europe would be like. He'd seen images in books and heard tales from relatives who'd visited Paris, yet nothing could truly prepare him for what was ahead. When the ship finally docked at Le Havre, Joseph stepped onto French soil for the first time. He was 15, alone and black in a country where nearly everyone was white. From there, Joseph took a train to Beauvais, a city roughly 80 kilometers north of Paris. This would be his home for the next several years, the place where he'd pursue his studies. The town was quaint, with cobblestone lanes and ancient stone buildings. Winters were harsh, far colder than anything Joseph had known in Haiti. But he adapted. He rented a modest room, enrolled in school, and threw himself into engineering studies with a commitment that amazed his instructors. Joseph possessed not just intelligence but remarkable discipline. He rose early each morning and studied late into the night, mastering French grammar until his writing surpassed most classmates. He dove into mathematics, physics, and technical drawing. His goal was to prove that a black man from Haiti could hold his own against anyone in Europe. Still, life in France wasn't easy for Joseph. People were courteous but kept their distance. Some had never encountered a black person before. They'd stare in the streets, whisper as he entered rooms. Joseph learned to let it slide. He poured himself into his studies, telling himself that once he earned his diploma, respect would follow. People would value his intellect, not judge him by his complexion. He believed this completely, and for a time it seemed possible. Joseph graduated with an engineering degree in the early 1900s, filled with pride. His mother shared that pride. He had accomplished exactly what she'd envisioned. Yet when Joseph began searching for work, a painful truth emerged. No one would hire a black engineer. It made no difference that he held the same credentials as his peers, that his French was flawless, that he was clearly capable and diligent. Employers took one look at him and suddenly had no openings. Applications went unanswered. Interview appointments led to claims that the position was already taken. Joseph tried dozens of places: engineering firms, construction companies, government agencies. The reply was always the same: no. This was France in the early 1900s. Racism wasn't codified like in America. There were no whites-only signs, no segregated facilities. But prejudice existed more subtly. It lingered in people's glances, in opportunities never extended, in doors that stayed firmly shut. Joseph experienced this daily. It was wearing him down. Eventually he found work, but nothing that utilized his engineering degree. Low-paying jobs requiring far less skill. He put in more effort than anyone, hoping talent would be recognized, but promotions never came, wages never rose. Less qualified white colleagues were always chosen ahead of him. Joseph felt trapped, hope slipping away. Then something occurred that shifted everything. In Villejuif, just south of Paris, Joseph encountered a young woman named Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue. Her father was a local wine merchant. She had soft brown hair, kind eyes, and a smile that made Joseph forget every hardship. Juliette was white. Her family was French, and in 1908, falling in love with a black man was far from socially acceptable. But Juliette didn't care about society's opinions. She cared about Joseph. She looked beyond skin color to see his mind, his warmth, his persistence, and she fell deeply in love. They met through a family friend who had been mentoring Joseph. Their early conversations were polite, formal, yet over months, something genuine grew between them. Joseph visited Juliette's home. They strolled together through Villejuif's streets, discussing books, dreams, the future. Joseph had never encountered anyone like her. She showed curiosity about Haiti, about his childhood, his mother, the ships he used to watch from the port. She truly listened, something no one else had done. Juliette's father wasn't pleased about the relationship. As a wine merchant, he had a reputation to uphold. His daughter marrying a black man would bring scandal, harm his business, make the family a target for gossip. But Juliette was resolute. She told her father she loved Joseph and intended to marry him, with or without his blessing. Eventually her father gave in, perhaps seeing Joseph's genuine devotion, perhaps recognizing he couldn't change her mind. On March 18, 1908, Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche and Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue wed in a modest ceremony. Joseph was 21, Juliette was 20. Despite all obstacles, they were finally united. Their early years of marriage brought happiness mixed with hardship. Joseph still struggled to secure proper employment. Discrimination hadn't faded. If anything, it intensified. Now, he wasn't just a black man. He was a black man with a white wife. Some couldn't tolerate this, treating him with open disdain, refusing to do business with him, making life as difficult as possible. Yet Joseph and Juliette persevered. They rented a small apartment and lived simply, and on February 19, 1909, their first daughter arrived. They named her Simone. She had her mother's eyes and her father's smile. Joseph held her and wept, promising silently to build a better life for this child. A year later, on July 2, 1910, their second daughter was born. They named her Louise, but unlike Simone, Louise arrived prematurely, tiny and fragile. Doctors doubted she'd survive. Joseph and Juliet spent weeks at her bedside, praying, hoping, refusing to surrender. Slowly, little Louise grew stronger. She lived, though ongoing medical issues demanded constant attention and expensive care. Joseph, with his limited earnings, struggled to keep up. The situation grew desperate. He worked long hours at jobs barely covering rent, while Juliet cared for two small children while pregnant with a third. Yes, by early 1912, Juliet learned she was expecting again. This should have brought joy, but for Joseph, it added more worry. How could he provide for 3 children on his current income? How could he manage Louise's medical expenses? How could he offer his family the life they deserved? Then Joseph had an idea: return to Haiti. It made perfect sense. In Haiti, his skin color wouldn't hold him back. His engineering degree would hold real value. His family had connections. His mother, still alive and respected, could help. He could find meaningful work, build a genuine career, and give his children opportunities France would never provide. Joseph discussed the plan with Juliet. Initially, she hesitated. She'd never been to Haiti, didn't speak Creole, and would leave behind her family and everything familiar. But she trusted Joseph completely and agreed to go. Joseph wrote to his mother in Haiti explaining the situation. His mother was overjoyed. She'd missed her son terribly and always hoped for his return. She immediately offered assistance, covering the family's passage to Haiti and ensuring they'd have everything upon arrival. A weight lifted from Joseph's shoulders. For the first time in years, hope felt real. Originally, they planned to leave France in late 1912 or early 1913. But upon learning of Juliet's pregnancy, Joseph decided to move sooner. He didn't want her traveling too far along. He wanted their baby born in Haiti, surrounded by family. His mother purchased first-class tickets for them aboard a French ocean liner, the SS France, scheduled to depart in April 1912. Everything was arranged, everything seemed perfect. Then Joseph discovered a detail that changed everything. The SS France had strict rules about children. All young passengers had to stay in the nursery during meals, not allowed to dine with parents. Joseph found this unacceptable. Simone was 3, Louise wasn't even 2, they were babies. Leaving them with strangers, while he and Juliet ate in a formal dining room, went against everything he believed as a father. He wanted to be with his daughters, to see their faces as they tried new foods, to comfort Louise if she grew scared. The SS France's policy felt cruel and unnecessary, and Joseph refused to accept it. He went to the ticket office, requested a refund, and began searching for another ship. That's when he learned about the Titanic. The RMS Titanic was the largest ship in the world, brand new, embarking on its maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City. Everyone talked about it. Newspapers called it unsinkable, a floating palace with luxuries unmatched by any other vessel. First-class passengers would enjoy a gymnasium, swimming pool, Turkish baths, and restaurants rivaling Paris's finest. Even second-class accommodations supposedly surpassed first class on other ships. Most importantly, the Titanic had no restrictive policies about children. Joseph could dine with his daughters, spend the voyage with them, and be the father he wanted to be. Joseph exchanged their first-class tickets on the SS France for second-class tickets on the Titanic. The family would board at Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912, sail to New York, and from there take another ship to Haiti. It meant a longer journey, but Joseph didn't mind. He felt excited. Finally, he was taking his family home. The days before departure were busy. Juliet packed their belongings. Joseph arranged to vacate their apartment, said goodbye to his few French friends, and wrote letters to Haitian relatives announcing their impending arrival. Simone and Louise were too young to understand but sensed the anticipation. Their father smiled more often, their mother hummed while folding clothes. Something wonderful was about to happen. On the morning of April 10th, 1912, the Laroche family traveled by train to Cherbourg, a port city on France's northern coast, known for its deep harbor. The Titanic was too massive to dock at the pier, so passengers were ferried to the ship on smaller vessels called tenders. The tender carrying the Laroches was the SS Nomadic, a sturdy white, painted boat flying the White Star Line flag. Joseph carried Louise in his arms as they boarded. Simone held her mother's hand, eyes wide with wonder. Dozens of other passengers filled the boat, speaking various languages, wearing elegant clothing. Some glanced curiously at the Laroche family, others looked with something less kind. Joseph noticed, he always noticed, but refused to let it bother him. Not today. Today marked the start of a new life. As the tender approached the Titanic, Joseph saw the ship for the first time and stopped breathing. It was colossal, unlike anything imaginable. The hull rose from the water like a black iron wall, so tall he had to tilt his head back to see the top. 4 massive smokestacks pointed skyward, painted in White Star's signature colors, buff yellow with black tops. The ship stretched longer than any building Joseph had ever entered. It looked permanent, invincible, as if it could never, ever sink. The tender pulled alongside, and passengers began climbing a gangway to the second-class entrance. Joseph helped Juliette, now visibly pregnant, and carried Louise, who'd fallen asleep against his shoulder. Simone walked between her parents, clutching her favorite doll. The family stepped onto the Titanic at approximately 6:30 in the evening. The sun was setting. Somewhere in the distance, the ship's orchestra played, and Joseph Laroche, the only black man on board, took a deep breath and smiled. They had made it. Their cabin was on E-deck in the second-class section, small but comfortable, with 2 beds, a wash basin, and a porthole overlooking the ocean. White painted walls, clean linens. Compared to their French apartment, it felt almost luxurious. Juliette sat on the bed and exhaled. The journey had exhausted her. Pregnancy added fatigue, but she felt happy. She looked at Joseph and reached for his hand. That first night on the Titanic, the family dined together in the second-class dining saloon. The room was beautiful oak, paneled walls, white tablecloths, crystal glasses. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved between tables, serving course after course. Simone was captivated by everything. Louise slept in her mother's arms. Joseph ordered unfamiliar dishes and laughed at something Juliette said. For a few hours he forgot discrimination, forgot struggles. He was simply a father enjoying dinner with his family on the world's most famous ship. But not everyone was welcoming. Some dining room passengers stared at the Laroches. A black man with a white wife and 2 mixed-race children was uncommon in 1912. Whispers and pointing followed. Joseph caught fragments of conversation, words not meant for him but perfectly understood. He pretended not to notice, focusing on Juliette and his daughters, refusing to let anyone ruin the moment. Over the following days, the Laroches established a routine. Joseph rose early, walked the decks, breathed the salt air, and watched the endless ocean. Juliette stayed in the cabin with the children, reading, playing games, resting. They met for meals and talked about Haiti. Joseph described beaches, mountains, the house where he grew up, the food his mother cooked, drums during carnival season. Juliette listened to every word, falling in love with a country she'd never seen. Other passengers continued treating the Laroches with a blend of curiosity and coolness. Some assumed the children weren't theirs. One woman reportedly thought Simone and Louise were Japanese due to their light brown skin and dark hair. Joseph overheard comments in English and French, understanding both languages perfectly, yet never responding or confronting anyone. He simply held his head high and walked on. He'd spent his whole life dealing with people who thought themselves superior. He wouldn't waste energy on them now. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, the Laroches attended a brief non-denominational church service in the second-class dining room, led by the ship's captain, Edward Smith. Passengers sang hymns, prayed, and gave thanks for the fair weather and smooth voyage. Joseph sat with his family in a back row. Not particularly religious, he still appreciated the moment of peace. Closing his eyes, he imagined his mother in Haiti, her face when she saw him again, holding her grandchildren for the first time. Just a few more days, and they'd be together. After the service, Joseph did something unusual. He went to the second-class smoking room. It was a space where men gathered to talk, drink, and play cards. Joseph rarely socialized with strangers, preferring time with Juliet and the children. Yet something drew him there that day, perhaps a desire to relax, to feel normal, like any other passenger. He found a corner seat, ordered a drink, and watched other men laugh and joke. For a moment he felt like he belonged. That evening the family shared their final dinner. The menu included lamb, roast beef, vegetables, and assorted desserts. Simone cleaned her plate, Louise fussed as usual, Juliet looked tired but content. Joseph gazed at his family across the table, overwhelmed with love so powerful it almost hurt. These three people meant everything. He'd crossed oceans for them, endured discrimination for them, and would do anything to keep them safe. After dinner, Juliet took the children back to the cabin. Joseph kissed each good night, told Simone to be good, whispered to Louise that Papa loved her, assured Juliet he'd come to bed soon. Then he returned to the smoking room, wanting to savor the last peaceful hours of the voyage. Tomorrow they'd arrive in New York. Tomorrow the real journey would begin at 11:40 p.m. Joseph felt a faint shudder run through the ship. He looked up from his drink. Others in the smoking room felt it too. Someone joked about hitting a whale, another laughed nervously. The ship's engine seemed to stop. The room grew very quiet. Joseph stood. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Walking out onto the deck, the night was freezing cold, stars incredibly bright, and scattered across the deck were pieces of ice, small chunks like broken glass glittering in the light from ship's windows. Joseph picked one up, cold and wet in his hand. Looking toward the bow, he saw something that stopped his heart. A massive wall of white scraping along the Titanic's starboard side. An iceberg. Joseph dropped the ice and ran toward his cabin. He tore through the corridors like a man possessed. Heart pounding so hard he felt it in his throat, breath coming in sharp gasps that burned his lungs. The elegant hallways, welcoming just hours before, now felt like a maze designed to trap him. He turned left, turned right, nearly colliding with a steward walking calmly in the opposite direction as if nothing had happened, as if the world wasn't ending. The steward, a pale young man perhaps 20, in a crisp white uniform, told Joseph there was nothing to worry about. The ship had struck some ice, he said, but everything was under control. Passengers should return to their cabins and await further instructions. His voice was steady, hands not shaking, but Joseph saw something in his eyes contradicting every word. Fear. Pure, undeniable fear. Joseph didn't believe him. He pushed past and kept running. Corridors were filling with confused passengers, some still in nightclothes, hair disheveled, eyes heavy with interrupted sleep. Others fully dressed, carrying suitcases and valuables as if preparing to disembark at a scheduled port. A woman cried nearby. A child asked unanswerable questions. The ship's lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Joseph felt the floor tilt slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the bow. Something was very, very wrong. Reaching the cabin on E-deck, he threw open the door with such force it slammed against the wall. Juliet sat up in bed, eyes wide with confusion and dawning terror. Hands pressed against her pregnant belly as if protecting the child inside. The children still slept. Louise curled in her small bed, thumb in mouth, breathing slow and peaceful. Simone sprawled across her mattress, one arm hanging over the edge, favorite doll clutched against her chest. The impact had been so gentle, so deceptively mild, it hadn't disturbed their dreams. Juliet asked what was happening. Her voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a woman trying very hard not to panic. But Joseph saw fear forming behind her eyes, saw her hands tremble slightly as she pushed blankets aside. He told her to get dressed, to dress the children warmly. They needed to go up to the deck immediately. He didn't explain why. No time for explanations, no time for questions. Every wasted second brought them closer to disaster. Juliet moved quickly. 7 months pregnant, her body heavy and slow, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She pulled a thick wool coat over her nightgown, grabbed scarves and hats from the small wardrobe, wrapped Simone in a blanket, lifting the sleepy child with a mother's practiced efficiency. Simone murmured unintelligibly and nestled against her mother's shoulder. Louise was harder to wake, whimpering and crying when lifted, her small body stiff with protest. But there was no time for comfort or soothing words. Joseph grabbed the life jackets stored in the cabin. He'd noticed them when they first boarded, tucked in a corner near the wardrobe, and thought nothing of them then. A formality, a precaution for a danger that would never come. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone said so. Newspapers, the company, probably even the captain. But now those life jackets seemed like the most important objects in the world. Joseph pulled them out and examined them quickly. Made of cork, covered in white canvas, with straps tying around chest and waist. Bulky and uncomfortable, but they'd keep a person afloat. They'd buy time. Joseph helped Juliet put on her life jacket, fingers fumbling with unfamiliar straps. He fastened one around Simone, now fully awake and beginning to cry. He held Louise while Juliet adjusted her own jacket, the little girl squirming and wailing in his arms. She didn't understand what was happening, why her father's hands were shaking, only that something was wrong, something was different, and she was scared. The family left the cabin and made their way toward the upper decks. Corridors were more crowded now, passengers emerging from rooms, some moving with purpose, others frozen in confusion. Stewards were everywhere, voices artificially calm, instructions maddeningly vague. Please proceed to the boat deck. Please put on your life jackets. Please remain calm. But how could anyone remain calm when the floor was tilting, lights flickering, the greatest ship ever built dying beneath their feet? Joseph led his family through the maze of corridors and staircases, growing more crowded each minute. He held Louise in one arm and pulled Juliet with the other. Simone clung to her mother's coat, small legs struggling to keep up, face pale with terror. Surrounding sounds were overwhelming. Crying, shouting, praying, distant crashes of something heavy falling deep within the ship, the groan of metal under stress, and beneath it all, a horrible, subtle sound Joseph would remember for the rest of his life, the sound of water rushing, pouring, unstoppable water flooding into the lower decks. When they finally reached the boat deck, Joseph grasped the full scope of disaster. The deck was chaos, hundreds of passengers crowded near the lifeboats, pushing, shoving, crying, praying. Officers in white uniforms shouted orders no one seemed to hear. Crew members struggled with ropes and pulleys, trying to lower boats. Women screamed for husbands, children cried for parents. The cold was brutal, far worse than anything Joseph had experienced in France, below freezing, every breath like swallowing ice. Stars above shone impossibly bright, indifferent to the suffering below, and the ship's orchestra was playing. Joseph could hardly believe it. In the middle of this nightmare, musicians stood on deck, instruments in hand, playing cheerful melodies as if at a garden party. The music was surreal, almost offensive in its normalcy, clashing violently with screams and chaos, creating dissonance that made the whole scene feel like a fever dream. Later, Joseph would learn the orchestra was instructed to play to keep passengers calm. Later, he'd understand the bravery of those musicians continuing even as the ship sank beneath them. But in that moment, the music only made everything worse. Joseph pushed through the crowd, eyes scanning lifeboats. He needed to find one still loading, needed to get his family off this ship. The Titanic was sinking. He could feel it now, the unmistakable tilt, gravity shifting beneath his feet. The bow was going down, stern rising. Time was running out. He spotted a lifeboat on the port side. An officer stood near, by calling for passengers, women and children first. He kept shouting. It was the rule of the sea, the code of honor. Men would wait, find another way, die so women and children could live. Joseph understood the rule. He accepted it, but accepting didn't make it any easier. Juliet looked at Joseph, tears streaming down her face, cold wind biting her cheeks, turning skin red and raw. She didn't want to leave him. She grabbed his arm with strength he didn't know she possessed, fingers digging into his coat, eyes pleading for him to come. Joseph shook his head. He couldn't. He knew he couldn't. The officer was watching. Rules were clear. If Joseph tried to board, he'd be stopped, thrown back, maybe even shot. He'd heard stories of officers using guns to maintain order during shipwrecks. He wouldn't risk it, wouldn't risk his family's chance to survive. He told Juliet he'd find another way, that more lifeboats waited on the other side, that he'd see her in New York. He told her to be strong, take care of the children, never forget how much he loved her. His voice was steady, but inside he was breaking, screaming. He didn't want to let her go, didn't want to watch his family disappear into darkness, but he had no choice. The officer gestured impatiently for Juliet to board. Other women already climbed in, faces white with fear, movements clumsy and desperate. Juliet hesitated. She looked at Joseph one more time, memorizing his face, burning his image into memory. He held Louise in his arms, the little girl's face pressed against his shoulder, small body shaking with cold and fear. Simone stood between them, looking up at parents with eyes that didn't understand. Joseph handed Louise to Juliet. The transfer was awkward, complicated by life jackets, the crowd, the ship's rocking. Louise wailed as she passed from father to mother. Joseph kissed his daughter's forehead, lips lingering on cold skin. He whispered that Papa loved her, that everything would be okay. Then he lifted Simone and placed her in the lifeboat next to her mother. The 3-year-old immediately started crying, reaching for her father with both arms, small voice cutting through chaos like a knife. But something went wrong. In the confusion and crowd, the lifeboat began lowering before everyone was properly seated. Juliet and Simone were pushed toward one side by the surge of boarding passengers, while Louise was still in Joseph's arms. He'd handed her to Juliet, but somehow in the chaos the child had been passed back. Or perhaps he hadn't let go, holding his daughter 1 second too long, savoring her weight, not realizing the boat was already descending. Ropes creaked, pulleys groaned. The lifeboat dropped several feet, then stopped, swinging slightly in frigid air. Juliet screamed. She could see Louise still on deck, still in Joseph's arms, getting farther away each second. She reached out, arms stretched toward her baby, face twisted with anguish almost inhuman. Joseph tried to push forward, but too many people pressed against him from every direction. A crewman blocked his path, arms spread wide, face hard and suspicious. The crewman saw a black man approaching the lifeboat and assumed the worst, thought Joseph was trying to board, take a place belonging to women and children. He didn't see a father trying to reunite his family. He saw a threat. Joseph shouted, begged. He pointed at Juliet in the lifeboat, at Louise in his arms. "That is her mother," he said. "This is her daughter. Please let me give her the baby." But the crewman didn't move, didn't listen. Seconds ticked away. The lifeboat descended, and Louise remained on deck. In that moment, Joseph made a decision that would haunt Juliet for the rest of her life. He turned to a stranger standing nearby, a woman he'd never seen before and would never see again, and thrust Louise into her arms. The woman was startled, confused, but Joseph didn't give her time to react. He begged her to pass the child to the woman in the boat, pointing at Juliet, whose screams now rose above the chaos. "That is her mother," he said. "Please, please give her the baby, save my daughter." The stranger looked at the crying child in her arms, at the lifeboat descending into darkness, at the black man with tears streaming down his face. And then she did something Joseph would never be able to thank her for. She leaned over the railing and passed Louise down to another passenger standing below, who passed her to another and another. A chain of strangers united by a single purpose until finally the little girl reached Juliet's outstretched arms. Mother and daughter were reunited. The lifeboat continued descending. Joseph stood at the railing and watched his family disappear into darkness. The lifeboat hit black water with a splash impossibly loud in the night stillness. Crew members began rowing, pulling away from the sinking ship, putting distance between themselves and disaster. Joseph could see Juliet's face in dim light, growing smaller as the boat moved away. Their eyes met across the growing distance. She was crying, holding both daughters against her chest, one in each arm, as if she could protect them from the whole world. She mouthed something he couldn't hear over wind and chaos, but he understood. She was telling him she loved him. She was telling him to survive. She was telling him to find a way. Joseph raised his hand in a final wave. He tried to smile, wanting her last memory of him to be a smile, to remember him as brave, strong, hopeful. He didn't want her to see the terror in his heart, didn't want her to know he'd already accepted his fate. The lifeboat disappeared into darkness, and Joseph was alone. He didn't move for a long time. He stood at the railing, hands gripping cold metal, eyes fixed on the spot where the lifeboat had vanished. The Titanic listed badly now, tilting forward at an angle making it hard to stand. Water poured into lower decks through gashes in the hull. The bow sank, stern rose, the great ship was dying, and nothing could save it. Around Joseph, chaos continued. Passengers ran in every direction, searching for lifeboats already gone. Officers fired guns into the air, trying to maintain order. Men jumped into freezing water, preferring quick death to slow agony of waiting. The orchestra had stopped playing. Lights flickered more frequently, casting deck in alternating brightness and shadow. Screams of the dying and desperate filled the air like a symphony of despair. Joseph walked back toward the second-class smoking room. He didn't know why, perhaps wanting somewhere familiar, away from crowds and screaming. Perhaps needing a moment to think, process, accept. The smoking room was nearly empty when he arrived. A few men sat at tables drinking whiskey, playing cards, waiting for the end. They'd accepted their fate, knew there weren't enough lifeboats, that water was freezing, that even if they jumped, they'd survive only minutes. So they sat and drank and waited. Joseph sat in the same chair he'd occupied just 2 hours before, the same chair where he'd dreamed about Haiti, imagined his mother's face upon seeing him again. He thought about Juliet, Simone, Louise, and the baby Juliet carried the child who would never know its father. He thought about his mother in Haiti, who'd receive a letter in weeks telling her her son was dead. He thought about all he'd never do, places never see, moments never share with loved ones. And he thought about the life he'd lived 25 years, all he'd been given. 25 years of struggle, discrimination, fighting for every opportunity. He'd left Haiti as a boy, crossed an ocean for education, studied harder and worked longer than anyone else. Still, it hadn't been enough. Skin color had followed him everywhere, closing doors that should have opened, denying chances others took for granted. He'd loved and been loved, married a woman who saw past color, fathered 2 beautiful daughters with a third on the way. He'd tried so hard to build a good, meaningful life, and now it ended on a sinking ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Joseph closed his eyes. He thought about Juliet in the lifeboat, holding their daughters close. He imagined them rescued, arriving in New York, traveling to Haiti, starting a new life without him. He imagined his children growing up, attending school, falling in love, having children of their own. He imagined Juliet growing old, hair graying, face lined with years. He hoped she'd find happiness, peace. He hoped she'd tell their children about him, the father who loved them more than life itself. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic broke apart and sank beneath the North Atlantic's waves. The sound was unlike anything survivors had ever heard. A deep groaning roar as the ship tore in two, a thunderous crash as the bow plunged into depths, a moment of eerie silence as the stern rose, vertical, pointing towards stars like a dark finger accusing heaven. Then screams, hundreds upon hundreds, as more than 500 people plunged into water so cold it stopped hearts within minutes. Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche was among the dead. His body was never recovered. Lifeboats drifted in darkness for hours, surrounded by cries of the dying. Passengers huddled together for warmth, bodies shaking with cold and shock. Some prayed, some wept, Some stared into darkness with empty eyes, unable to process what they'd witnessed. Screams from the water gradually faded as cold claimed its victims. Within an hour, only silence remained, terrible, absolute silence that seemed to swallow the whole world. Juliet held her daughters close throughout the night. She didn't sleep, didn't speak, simply held Simone and Louise against her body, trying to keep them warm, trying to keep them alive. Her eyes never left the horizon. She kept hoping to see Joseph in another lifeboat, kept telling herself he'd found a way to survive. He was smart, resourceful. He'd promised they'd meet again in New York. Joseph never broke promises to her. He wouldn't start now, but as hours passed, hope began to fade. Other lifeboats gathered, sharing survivors, information, grief. No one had seen Joseph. No one had seen a black man in any boat. Juliet's heart sank with each passing minute. She began to understand what she'd refused to accept. Her husband was gone, father of her children gone, the man she'd loved since a young girl at the bottom of the Atlantic. Around 4 a.m., survivors saw lights on the horizon. A ship approached the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner that received Titanic's distress signal and changed course immediately, racing through the night at full speed, navigating the same ice field that destroyed Titanic. The Carpathia's captain pushed his ship to its limits, arriving in just over 3 hours, a journey that should have taken much longer. His decision saved hundreds of lives. Carpathia began picking up survivors from lifeboats one by one. Rope ladders lowered over the side, crew members reached down to pull freezing passengers aboard. Some survivors were so weak they had to be carried. Some were unconscious. Some were children separated from parents in chaos, never to see them again. Juliet and her daughters were among 706 survivors rescued by Carpathia. When Juliet climbed aboard the rescue ship, she immediately began searching for Joseph. She walked through crowds of survivors, eyes scanning every face, voice calling his name. She asked officers if they'd seen a black man, described him in detail. Height, clothes, engineering books he always carried. His smile that lit up his whole face. No one had seen him, no one could help her. As hours passed, as Carpathia completed rescue operations and turned toward New York, Juliet's hope died completely. She sat on deck, surrounded by crying widows and traumatized children, and accepted her husband was gone. Carpathia arrived in New York on the night of April 18, 1912. More than 30,000 people waited at the pier. Reporters with cameras, family members holding photographs, curious onlookers hoping for a glimpse of history. Rain fell, a cold drizzle matching the crowd's mood. Juliet walked down the gangway with Simone in one hand and Louise in the other. She was 25 years old, 7 months pregnant, a widow, utterly, completely alone. Charitable organizations took her in. Women's Relief Committee provided money and clothes. French consulate helped with paperwork and translation. Everyone was kind, sympathetic, but kindness couldn't bring Joseph back. Sympathy couldn't fill the empty space beside her in bed. Juliet stayed in New York several weeks, waiting, hoping, refusing to leave in case Joseph was somehow still alive. But no news came. No body was ever found. Finally, she made a decision. She wouldn't stay in America, wouldn't continue to Haiti. She'd go home to France, to her family, to the only place where she might find some measure of peace. In May 1912, Juliet and her daughters boarded another ship and sailed back across the Atlantic. The journey was a nightmare. Every creak of the hull made her flinch. Every swell of waves made her think of that night. Simone had screaming nightmares. Louise cried constantly, sensing her mother's grief even if she couldn't understand it. By the time they reached France, all three were broken. Juliet's family welcomed her with open arms. Her father held her while she wept. Her mother took care of the children. No one asked questions, forced her to talk. They simply surrounded her with love and waited for her to heal. On December 17, 1912, 8 months after the Titanic sank, Juliet gave birth to her third child, a boy. She named him Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche Jr., after the father he'd never know. The baby was healthy and strong, with his father's dark, intelligent eyes full of life. Juliet held her son and cried because he was beautiful and because Joseph would never see him. Juliet never remarried. She dedicated her life to raising her 3 children, working multiple jobs to support them, sacrificing her own happiness for their future. She never forgot Joseph. Every year on the sinking's anniversary, she'd light a candle and sit alone in darkness, remembering. She never spoke publicly about the Titanic, trauma too deep, wounds too raw. When reporters came seeking interviews, she turned them away. When filmmakers offered money for her story, she refused. She'd built a wall around that night and wouldn't let anyone tear it down. The children grew up in the shadow of their father's absence. Simone remembered fragments, cold screams, her father's face at the railing. Louise remembered nothing, only what her mother told her. Joseph Jr. never knew his father at all, only stories, photographs, the weight of a name carrying so much history. Decades passed, the world changed. 2 world wars came and went. The Titanic became legend, subject of books, films, endless fascination. But Joseph Laroche's name never appeared, his face never shone, his story never told. History had erased him as it erased so many others who didn't fit the narrative. Juliet died in 1980 at age 91, her silence unbroken. Simone died a few years later, taking her memories to the grave. Only Louise remained. In 1995, Louise Laroche was 84 years old. She lived in Paris in a small apartment filled with photographs and memories. She'd lived a long life, seen everything, and was tired of the silence. When a representative from the Titanic Historical Society contacted her seeking her story, she said yes. The interview lasted hours. Louise told them everything: her father's childhood in Haiti, his education in France, discrimination, marriage, decision to immigrate, exchange of tickets, night of April 14th, chaos, separation, the stranger passing her from hand to hand, her mother's grief, her brother born 8 months later, carrying his father's name. For the first time in 83 years, the world heard the story of Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche. Louise died on January 28, 1998, at age 87, one of the last Titanic survivors. But before she went, she ensured her father would never be forgotten again. Today, Joseph Laroche's name appears in museums, his photograph hangs in exhibitions, his story taught in schools. He's no longer invisible, no longer erased. He was a father who loved his family, a man who fought against injustice, the only black passenger on the Titanic. And his story will echo through history forever.